So I will start this recording. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining me on this pretty hot day in March 19th, 2026, Monterey Bay Firewise Partners Forum. And I'm really excited about today. We have two really special guest speakers, Steve Hawks, Senior Director from IBHS, or the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And we also have Jeremy Connally from Farmers Insurance. His branch or agency is Connally Agency, and Steve Hawks will be talking a little bit about the 2025 research findings from IBHS about the LA County wildfires last year. And Jeremy Connally will be discussing some insurance options and insurance discount options available to you in Monterey Bay area. And to get started, wanted to go over a brief agenda. So introductions, I'd like to get kind of the lay of the land, who's in our meeting today. Also introduce Steve Hawks, have him speak and answer some questions. Jeremy Connolly then, and then also plug our 2026 Firewise Community Needs Survey. We're still accepting responses, and then that really helps us build programs like this. Also some resources out of this forum, and then some upcoming events in March and April. So if you would like to drop your name and which Firewise community, if you are a part of one, or your organization in the chat, and then maybe one goal for your Firewise community that you have in 2026. And for me, a goal for the end of March and April would be to complete an initial handbook. So I found one from Placer County, and they've allowed us to adapt it for Monterey County. So keep an eye out for that one. And also, as a quick reminder, if you prefer not to be on video, please turn off your camera. And also, please wait for speakers to be finished for any verbal questions that you have, or drop them in the chat and I'll try to get them to our speakers. So I'm just looking at the chat. Yeah, hi Rainer, thank you for making it. Courtney, Brady, Liz, yeah, San Benito, Carmel Valley, Big Sur represented. It's awesome. Right. We also have North County represented as well. So that was great to see. Yeah, so thank you everyone for carving out this time to join us. And I think maybe we can get started a little bit earlier with Steve, if you're comfortable with that. I did a quick kind of run through at the beginning, and I think some time at the end will be helpful to get the other closeout stuff.
Yeah, I'm ready to go whenever
Awesome.
you'd like for me to.
Yeah. So I will make you co-host so you can be able to share your screen. And just as a short introduction, Steve Hawks is a senior director for Wildfire at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. IBHS is an independent 501c3 nonprofit focused on scientific research and communications organization. And just a branch of that is Wildfire. I think they also do wind and other, disasters of the sort. And he'll be speaking on some recent wildfire research that IBHS has done regarding the 2025 Los Angeles County wildfires. Also, vegetation in zone zeros, recent, I think, research that they've done, and construction costs for wildfire resistant homes, and comparing those to, I believe, losing your home, but I think you have more information on that too. So I'll stop my share right now, and you can share your screen for your presentation.
Okay, I'll work on that. And here we go. It's coming up. Can you see my screen okay?
Let's see. Yes. See it, great. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. And Jennifer, thanks for inviting me and the introduction. As she mentioned, I'm a senior director for Wildfire at IBHS, and my background is in the California Fire Service, having worked for CAL FIRE for 30 years, the first 24 from firefighter to battalion chief in the field responding to emergencies of all types. And then the last 6 years working underneath the Office of the State Fire Marshal in a division called the Community Wildfire Preparedness and Mitigation Division. underneath now State Fire Marshal Daniel Berlant. And Jennifer gave you a quick kind of overview of IBHS. We are a nonprofit that is funded by the insurance and reinsurance industry. And they fund the research that we do on wind, wind-driven rain, hail, and wildfire. And the picture on the screen you see is our research center, which is located in Richburg, South Carolina. And the big circles on the front of that big structure in the center are fans, and there's 105 of them. They're each 6 feet in diameter and can collectively blow up to 135-mile-an-hour wind through that big 6-story concrete structure behind it. And that's where we do the wind, wind-driven rain, and hail. And for wildfire, we do ember exposure inside, where we can cast embers onto a structure and see how it responds to that ember exposure. And on the backside of the research center, the big 6-story structure, we are doing structure-to-structure fire spread research in coordination with CAL FIRE. And for wildfire, we really focus on that significant fire event where we have the potential for the fire to be like the Eaton and Palisades and other highly destructive fires that we've seen, and how can we narrow the path to a fire that starts from becoming a conflagration. And so we really look at a set of 3 factors that, whoops, let me go backwards. I think it's a slight delay on my side with the clicking. Try and go back here. So we look at 3 factors that set the table, if you will, for a conflagration to unfold. And that's when we experience that large loss where hundreds or thousands of structures are destroyed in a single event. And that's drought that occurs at any scale, where the vegetation, where the wildfires typically start, are very dry and receptive to the spread of the fire through them. And then wind is the single biggest factor of extreme fire behavior and can push a fire into a community and through those drought-stricken fuels very quickly. And then we have to have a start. And it really doesn't matter what causes the start of the fire, just that we have a spark under those drought conditions with a high wind like we had on the Palisades and the Eaton fire and others that'll set the table again for that conflagration to unfold. And let's take a look here. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like the videos want to play. Let's take a look at the impact of wind on the fire. And so on the right-hand side, you can see that there's no wind on this large shed that we're burning and looking at fire spread, structure fire spread. So without wind, the flames and the convective heat of the fire go straight up. And you can see the height listed on the screen of this fire. It's about 20 foot tall. And if the video would play, you'd see the flames kind of go up and down and the height extend out some. And if I was to stand over on the side of the fire and hold my hand out, I'd be experiencing the radiant heat from this fire, just as you would experience when you sit around a campfire. But if I was able to hold my hand above the fire, this is a much more intense heat. This is the convective heat, and most of it is going straight up. But when you add wind to it, like on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that the flames bend over and they also elongate. And you can see that the flames here are about 38 feet long. And if you could see the video playing again, you'd see them reach out to around 50 feet. And they kind of goes in and out, but it bends the flames over and it elongates them so they can reach out and touch objects at a further distance. And not only that, but the convective heat that would normally go straight up is bending over and going sideways too. So if you were to stand downwind, here you'd not only be experiencing the radiant heat from the fire, but also the convective heat and potentially being touched by the flames themselves. So it's a much more intense heat. And so remember this later on, this slide, when I show you some research that we did around vegetation and this convective heat and radiant heat concept. So if I could get the slide to advance. Okay, so So let's talk about how a fire goes from a start to a conflagration. So it doesn't look like it wants to play. Normally you'd see this flickering. Um, so we have a start of a fire in the wildland area, and that's typically where the fires start, right? In natural vegetation, and when the fire starts, that vegetation is creating embers, flames, and radiant heat. I'm going to try and get this video to play. There we go. Okay. So the embers that flow into the community, that's generally the first order of the fire's entry into the community. The embers flow out in front of the main fire front. They land in the community. And if they land on the structure, maybe pass in through a vent of the structure or land around the structure, they can ignite a combustible item, and that can lead to the ignition of the home. As we see in the Fort McMurray fire in Canada, that the flames didn't cross the street there. It was the embers that went over the street and brought that fire into the community in that particular location. So again, whether it's the embers flowing into, or I'm sorry, let me back up for a second. As the embers are flowing in, the main fire front will continue to advance towards the outer edge of the community. And those homes that abut the outer edge will experience the flames and the radiant heat and the embers from the fire. So they get kind of the full brunt of the frontal advancement of that wildfire. And whether it's the embers that flow into the community and ignite structures, or it's the fire front that ignites them on the outer edge, as structures begin to ignite, then the fire fundamentally changes from a wildland fire to an urban fire, where it's burning urban fuels, so homes, other structures that are on the property like outbuildings or ADUs, fences, mulch, vegetation, vehicles, anything that's combustible with that we have on our properties is fuel for the fire, and can enable the fire to spread within the community and between structures. And so once the fire becomes established within the community, there's really another set of factors that determine how easy it can become for that fire to be very destructive, be that fire where hundreds or thousands of structures are lost in a single event. And the first one is structure density, or the spacing between structures, which includes other structures on a property, ADUs and outbuildings and things, not just the main structures themselves, but the closer the spacing is, the easier it is. If you go back to that where we looked at the effect of wind on the fire, the easier it is under those strong wind days for the fire to bend over and touch the next structure downwind and to ignite it directly. And then the next one is those connective fuels, is what we term it. Connective fuels are the pathways that a fire can travel between structures or within the community through a series of combustible items. And that could be anything, again, combustible. It's those urban fuels that we're talking about that allow for the spread of the fire. And then the last item is we look at the building materials that the structures are made out of and their resilience to withstand the fire that they're experiencing. And so the more combustible materials are used on the structure, the easier it is for that structure to ignite from their flames, the radiant heat, and the embers from the fire and lead to its loss. And so as we look at these different videos, the embers from the Eaton fire in the upper left corner, upper right is the flames in the Palisades fire. That's what our homes are exposed to in our communities. It's those embers and flames and the radiant heat that lead to the ignitions of the homes. And if you look to the bottom videos and on the left-hand side, when I talked about those connective fuels or all those urban fuels, that once the fire reaches the community, it's those wood fences that are burning here in this fire in Texas, and the sheds and the awnings and the things that allow for the fire to get from one location to the next, ultimately reaching the structure and igniting it. or on the right-hand side on the Marshall Fire in Colorado, where we have that tight structure spacing. And when one structure is ignited and you have that strong wind component, it can easily lead to the ignition of the next structure that is downwind, even if that structure was to be built with good building materials that are very fire resilient. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But this is what we define as the exposure. This is what our homes and our communities have to be able to withstand in order for us to significantly reduce the likelihood that a fire will become that conflagration fire. And we really focus on preventing the ignition because we know in our research, our post-fire analysis, and looking at CAL FIRE's damage and inspection data that once a structure ignites, there's over a 90% chance that it will be completely lost. And so we need to prevent them from igniting in the first place. And so that's what we're going to kind of look at through the rest of this presentation, but it's also what we examine as we do our research at our research center, which you saw on one of the opening screens. There's the backside where we're doing that structure to structure fire spread research and looking at the spacing between structures and the materials that they're made out of and the connectivity of fuels that are between them that like this that allow the fire to spread to the structure, and including vegetation, which Jennifer mentioned earlier, which I'll get to, and that lead to the loss of structures. And what we learn at the research center is also what we take out to the field when we do a post-fire analysis. And you see some of our field deployments that we've done, most recently on the LA fires in 2025. And we've published some reports from our findings that you can see are obtained from our website. And I also have a QR code to the LA conflagration report at the end of the presentation. But what we see at our research center, as well as what we see during our post-fire deployments, is very similar. And during our deployment, we looked at those conflagration factors, the structure density, the connective fuels that make up the exposure to the home. And we looked at structure spacing, those urban fuels, and fuel coverage in the 5 foot that surrounds the house, and then the 5 to 30 foot range on each side of the house. And fuel coverage, we defined it as anything that's combustible. So fences, mulch, vegetation, other buildings that are in that space and whatnot, that made up the percentage of fuel coverage for each side of the structure. And then we looked at those building materials or the resilience that the structure has to withstand the fire and all the different components of the structure. And again, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, what we see at our research center is very similar to what we see out in the field during our field deployments. And really, it's the fire can take under those extreme conditions the path of least resistance, and even one vulnerability in the structure can easily be exploited by the fire of that type of magnitude. And so if we look at those three factors again, looking at the structure density, what we found in this, and is also very consistent with what we found during our Lahaina deployment, is that structure spacing is one of the most deterministic factors of structure loss. And at 10-foot spacing, even well-hardened structures can experience substantial exposure and damage and loss. And so that is not just a factor that we've found during our deployments, but it's also been something that NIST has noted in a number of research that they've done on different deployments like the Camp Fire and their hazard mitigation methodology research that they published as well. And it's also a finding from UC Berkeley's report that they published about last October using the CAL FIRE damage inspection data. So structure density is definitely one of the most critical factors for determining structure loss during a wildfire. But let's take a look at that. So say we have a high density area. It could be the ABC streets in the Palisades. It could be large areas of Altadena for the Eaton fire. Whatever it is, when we have a block of homes that are generally surrounded by streets on all sides of them, the wildfire will flow into that block through embers and begin to ignite combustible items or those urban fuels. And that'll lead to the ignition of the house. And then because of the tight spacing, that fire will travel from home to home to home till it reaches the end of the block where we have the home setback from the sidewalk of the street. Then we have a sidewalk, and we have the road, and we have those same things on the other side of the street. And this creates too much distance between this last structure and the first structure on the other side of the street for the flames and the radiant heat from this house burning to ignite this one. But the embers will travel very easily across the street, ignite combustible items again, start the next structure on fire, and continue that cascading structure to structure fire spread on the next block, where we repeat the same process over and over again, as we saw in the Eaton and Palisades fires. So if we look at the CAL FIRE damage inspection data on the Palisades fire, all the structures with the red house symbol on them are destroyed. This green one is very minor or very affected damage. It's cosmetic damage, non-structural. And the black structure is no damage at all. So we see the vast majority of the structures in this particular area were completely destroyed. But we do see a series of 4 structures that had no damage to them. And if we drill down a little bit further and we look at the spacing between all the structures that surround this first one on the block, we look across the street, we have almost 100-foot spacing, 90 feet across the street on this direction, and almost 50 feet to the house on the same block. So undoubtedly, embers crossed this street and exposed all of these structures to the ember exposure, but the flames did not cross the street. Now, I will say that we, during our field deployment, did not particularly look at this situation that you see on the screen. So I can't say why these 4 homes survived when the vast majority of them around them burned. It could very well likely be that firefighters provided some intervention there and defended those structures and allowed them to survive. But let's say if that was the case, the firefighters, if they weren't there, these houses would have experienced extreme ember exposure from all of these structures burning around them. And if this one ignited, because there's 10-foot or so spacing between these next set of structures, this one would have ignited this one and this one and this one, leading to all of their loss. But because this one did not ignite, it has a positive impact on this next structure. And because this one did not ignite, it has a positive impact on the next one, and so on. So when we can stop the ignitions, even at tight structure spacing, then we're starting to reduce the likelihood of structure loss and that conflagration from unfolding. So if we go to the next factor and we look at the connective fuel piece, again, I mentioned that we looked at each side of the structures that we evaluated in the percent of fuel coverage in the first 5 feet, and then in the next zone, that zone 1 from 5 to 30 feet out. And again, percent of fuel coverage was anything that was combustible was factored into that percent of fuel coverage. And so we found that when there is more than 25% fuel coverage in that first 5 feet that surrounds the house, the likelihood of damage or destruction goes up to 90 to 100%. We also looked out, again, as I mentioned, in that zone 1, that 5 to 30 foot range. And we found that even when there's good fuel reduction, and even maybe more than what's needed, if you get down to 25% or lower in zone one fuel coverage wise, that if you had more fuel coverage in zone zero, that even that good fuel reduction in zone one didn't matter as much because zone zero provided that connective pathway for the fire to get to the house, even though it may even be a lower intensity fire. So it really goes back to pointing that of all the area that surrounds the structure, that first 5 feet is absolutely the most critical. We've seen it time and time again during our post-fire analysis in our research at the research center that when there's combustible items in that space, and it doesn't matter what the combustible item is, that it can lead to the ignition of that item and then the ignition of the home. And here's just a quick look at some of the items that we noted during our field deployment. A lot of the same things that you would suspect: fences, fences with vegetation on them, wood decks, pergolas, vehicles, sheds in that space. And then there's maybe a couple things that you may not think of, like trash cans. And here's two trash cans that were sitting side by side right in front of this garage door. Here's the bar that the wheels mount to on the trash can, one, and then the second one right there. And it's not so much the trash cans being plastic being the flammable part or the most flammable part, it's the contents of the trash can that under those extreme winds, it's easy for those lids on the trash can to flop up and remain open. And now you have a big opening for embers to flow in and ignite the contents and then create a very large amount of fire close to the structure. And then hot tubs is another one. We hear a lot about, well, a hot tub has water in it. And yes, it does, but it has two basic cavities to it. It has the inner portion where the water is held, and then the outer portion is really that hides the plumbing and all the pumps and everything that are inside. And that outer portion is combustible. And so we saw this particular location where embers flew in, accumulated up against the base of this hot tub, ignited it, and then led to a fairly extreme amount of damage to the structure. And it was near a loss because we saw this window completely fell out intact. This sliding glass door, which is two panes of tempered glass door, or two panes of tempered glass, completely broke out. This one leaned out. So there was a large opening here for embers and flames to get in, and for whatever reason they did not. So again, it's those combustible things, going back to those urban fuels. Anything that's combustible can ignite and allow for the spread of the fire from the flames, the radiant heat, and the embers. And looking at we did some vegetation research looking at the combustibility of vegetation in that first 5 feet that surrounds the structure. And what we found is it amplifies the damage to the structure. And I'll play a video for you here. And as you watch this video, I'll explain it. So this is two wood cribs that are stacked side by side, simulating a shed that is on fire. And the leading edge of this crib is 20 feet to the wall. So there's 20-foot distance across here. We did a number of these tests. This one you see obviously with plants in the middle of it, but we also did this same test without these plants. And what we found is these wood cribs burning alone caused some damage to the window, cracked window panes, some siding damage, but they never led to the ignition of the structure. But when we added plants at 3 foot from the wall out to the stem of the plant, then we saw the ignition of the wall and the ignition of the eaves. And so that's what we mean by amplifying damage. And what's happening is these were very well hydrated plants. And depending on how you look at live fuel moisture content, whether you look at the wet basis content, it was 163%. And if you're a firefighter, you know what that means. If you look at the dry basis content, this was 60% moisture content out of 100% of the total mass of the plant. So very wet. And if you go back to what I talked about earlier with that, when you add wind to the fire and the flames bend over and they elongate, and that convective heat that is very intense that normally goes up is now being pushed sideways. Within 7 minutes of the ignition of these cribs, we saw the ignition of the plants, and 10 seconds later, we saw the ignition of the wall. So it doesn't take very long under extreme conditions for even well-hydrated plants to have their fuel moisture content dry off, and you can see the fuel moisture being driven off of the plant right here, being driven off and allowing them to reach their ignition temperature. And while that's occurring, the flames and the heat, convective heat, radiant heat from this fire is warming the structure, the wall, the eaves, and getting close to its ignition temperature. And all it took was a little bit extra more for the plant to lead to the ignition of the wall and the eaves. And so this is on the Palisades fire. We saw the same thing. Hedges ignited, and you can see embers flowing in right here. And it doesn't mean that the hedge necessarily will ignite the house that's right next to it, but it can throw embers downwind and also ignite structures that are further downwind from it, as well as potentially the structure that's right next to it. And so when we looked at the other factor of the building materials, we saw that when you start stacking on resilient features, that it reduces the chance of damage to the structure as opposed to just doing one singular mitigation action. And so we talk about that at IBHS as a systems-based approach to wildfire mitigation. It's addressing all the vulnerabilities to the structure, from the roofing materials to the ground, and then the surrounding area out away from the home, to give the home the best chance of survival, particularly under these most extreme conditions. And we'll look at two specific examples both on the Palisades fire, where we had the fire. I think, even though the vegetation on this little hillside next to the structure burned, I think the fire came up below. But what we had here is a very small deck around this concrete with another hot tub sitting on top of it and a railroad tie retaining wall behind it. So the fire got all of that materials burning, but fortunately, this structure was very well built. Had cement fiberboard, 2 panes of tempered glass, enclosed eaves, Class A roof, non-combustible fascia board. And in looking at this small window that's right here, that was probably the weakest link in the building in this particular location, where the most exposure came from, 2 panes of tempered glass, the outer pane completely broke out, but the inner pane stayed intact. Now, had the inner pane broke, very likely that this structure would have been a total loss. Instead, because it stayed intact, it's still standing today. If we look over at this next structure on the right, we see a very steep canyon. Again, I believe that the fire came up from below here, and exposed this structure, this side, to a lot of radiant heat. And it's probably not real noticeable, but this glass has cracks in it from the fire. But again, a Class A roof, stucco siding, 2 panes of glass. I think it was 1 tempered, 1 annealed. But one of the weakest links in this structure was these foundational vents down here. And the homeowner, prior to the fire, had made a simple retrofit. If you look behind the outer mesh, you can see the mesh size behind it, which was the original mesh size of 1/4 inch. But they retrofitted it with 1/8 inch. And as the embers undoubtedly came up from the fire and tend to accumulate up against the base of a vertical and horizontal surface like this wall in the ground, there would have been a lot of ember exposure to the house right in this location. But that simple retrofit helped protect one of the most vulnerable components of that structure from that extreme fire. And so if you look at our wildfire prepared home program, It is based on over 10 years of our research, as well as that from other renowned research organizations like NIST and UL Fire Safety Research Institute. And we look to address those same things that I've been talking about during this entire presentation, reducing the exposure by looking at structure spacing and separation distances, those connected fuel pathways for the fire to burn to the house, and then the resilience of the structure to withstand that exposure from the fire. And our wildfire prepared home, or you might hear it referred to as the base level designation, is based on reducing the exposure to the structure from the embers. And so it addresses the exposure side by looking at the 5 and 30-foot range out from the house. Really particular attention to that first 5 feet, having nothing combustible in that space. And then addressing the resilience of the structure and looking at those components of the structure that are most vulnerable to the ember exposure. And that's the roof, the gutters, vents, and the bottom 6 inches of the wall where it meets the ground or a deck. And this is really the ideal starting place if you're looking, have an existing home that you're looking to retrofit to be more resilient. Address all those measures that are most vulnerable to the ember exposure. And if you're looking to build new or go above and beyond the just the resilience to the ember exposure, then we have another level of designation called the plus level that addresses the flames and the radiant heat from the fire in addition to those embers, and adds on all those components of the structure and more things around in that exposure area that address that vulnerability to those embers and flames, and looks at all those other components of the structure, like covering the gutters and the eaves and siding and so forth. And if you look at a comparison of, which is the most apples to apples comparison of our Wildfire Prepared Home Plus standard compared to the California Building Code Part 7, formerly known as Chapter 7A. And very comparable, and in a couple of instances, our Wildfire Prepared Home Plus goes a little bit above and beyond what Part 7 requires, like requiring the gutter cover to be non-combustible, 2 panes of tempered glass in a window instead of 1 pane tempered, and then having that the eaves are enclosed with a non-combustible material as well. And for a homeowner that is either building new or looking to retrofit, and they are interested in a wildfire prepared home designation from IBHS, we have a process established for the homeowner to go through along with our staff. And where we'd like the homeowner to start is really come to our wildfireprepared.org website and download this How to Prepare My Home checklist. And I even recommend printing it off, take it outside, walk around your house, compare it to your situation, and make a list of the things where they differ, and then work to mitigate those items. And when all those items are checked off the list and you're ready to submit an application, come back to our website, wildfireprepared.org, submit an application, submit some photographs along with it, and we'll do an initial an evaluation to ensure it looks like you're taking the steps to meet the designation requirements. And we'll send a third-party evaluator out to gather data and upload it into our system, where a IBHS employee will evaluate the data against the standard and issue the certificate of designation that you see down here in the bottom of the screen. And this designation is good for 3 years. And at the 1-year anniversary from the issuance of the designation and the 2-year anniversary, there's an annual review check just to make sure that the requirements are being maintained, because this isn't a one and done. There is maintenance involved with wildfire resilience, and we want to make sure that that's being accomplished as well. And this is a homeowner driven process. And then at the end of the 3 years, the designation expires and we go through another redesignation to get the designation back. And while we're looking at reducing the risk, what we're really focusing on again is reducing the ignitions. And when we can reduce ignitions, then we can reduce the likelihood that a fire will transition into that large loss or conflagration fire. And then we can increase the survivability of homes. And when we can make them more survivable, we also make them more insurable. And one of the questions we always get is about insurance, but I won't talk about that because you're going to hear about that next. But the other question we typically get is the cost. And so we've partnered with Headwaters Economics on several different cost studies over the years, but most recently in looking at the cost of rebuilding a home in Altadena after the Eaton fire. And Altadena is in kind of a unique situation because only the outer edge of the community where it abuts up against the Angeles National Forest, those homes in that particular zone are required to rebuild to the California Building Code Part 7. But the vast majority of Altadena is not required to rebuild with any wildfire resilience at all. And so we did this comparison to look at traditional or a home with no wildfire resilience compared to Part 7 of the Building Code, IBHS base level and plus level designation. And we only focused on those components and materials that make up the wildfire resilience. So we didn't look at the inside of the structure and all those things that you would make choices about when you're building a new home, but don't factor into wildfire resilience. And so the cost of the wildfire resilient factors for a traditional home was, or just the cost of building a traditional home was $59,000 in those same wildfire resilient factors like the roof, eaves, walls, etc. And then for adding wildfire resilience to Part 7 added $13,000, and then going over to Wildfire Prepared Home Plus an additional $2,000 added costs, or $15,000 total, which if you spread that over a 30-year mortgage equates to about $50 extra per month. And so with that, I'd like to share that we have available on our wildfireprepared.org website the homeowner checklist. We have our technical standard for the program. We also have some video series and an online learning that looks at each of the components of the structure and talks about its vulnerabilities and the mitigation actions and so forth. So we encourage you to go there and go through those online courses at your leisure. And then lastly, if you're interested in taking a look at the different reports that we produce from our LA deployment, here's a QR code that you can go to. And we did an early insights paper, what we knew about the fires within the first 1 to 2 weeks, early insights from our initial field observations. And then this last one here is a much deeper dive into our findings. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Jennifer.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you so much for your presentation and an in-depth presentation at that. I think you're still sharing. Oh, there we go.
Yep, I'm going to stop.
Thanks. So also, I think we only had one question. If anyone has any more, feel free to add them to the chat. So I'll read them out from Michael Waxter. So question here: to protect a wooden overhang, have you found that providing a horizontal soffit consisting only of steel vent screening, a 1/8 inch recommended size and material for foundation, and attic vent screening provides adequate protection for a typical home retrofit to enclose the eaves?
So I'm assuming this has like a, I'm sorry, can you say that again? I'm trying to make sure I can
It's a
understand
pretty
that.
long question. So
Jennifer, can you hear
yes.
me? This is Michael. I can just ask the question probably clearer.
Okay.
To enclose the eave, can you just put in that 1/8 inch steel vent screening horizontally instead of like completely enclosing it with like fiber cement? Because since it stops the ember from entering the foundation vents and the attic vents, would that also equally, on the same logic, prevent the the overhang from embedding an ember?
Yeah, so for an open eave design, like you described, where you have vents that are in that space, make sure that they have at least that 1/8 inch mesh or a flame and ember resistant vent, either one. And that will, and then also look at the what's called the freeze blocking that's between the rafter tails, and ensure that there's no gaps that can enter into the attic space behind it that are greater than 1/8 inch. So you can enclose those spaces using a durable caulking material to prevent embers from getting in there. That should take care of your exposure from those embers. When we say enclose the eaves with a non-combustible material, that's to protect that space from the flames and the radiant heat. And just the mesh alone won't do that.
Oh, I see. I gotcha. Okay, thank you.
IBHS.
Okay. Thanks, Michael, for your question. Steve, for your answer. And I think Pam, you have your hand raised for a question.
I do. It's actually Mike Kaplan, who is also joined us here. So
Hi, Mike.
Hi. So, Mr. Hawks, this is really a suggestion for a research project for the Institute,
Okay.
which is to research the connection, if there is one, between regulations having to do with fuel reduction work, even creating defensible space, with hardening homes. Michael Waxer, who just spoke a moment ago, is on our board, our Fire Safe Council board, and he's an architect. And he makes the point that if you want to change your roof from a wood shake roof to a Class A composition shingle roof or clay tiles or something that are less flammable, that if you're in a design review area, that costs you all kinds of application fees, and you have to hire experts and you have to go to hearings. So here in Monterey County, I would suggest that Monterey County be a study area for the regulatory problems that get in the way of even being able here in California to comply with the 100-foot defensible space requirement in state law. That if that would involve cutting a tree or sensitive habitat, which can be broadly defined in the California Coastal Act. If you were to give us a scientific basis for the connection between loss of homes and lives and regulatory roadblocks to being able to prepare for fires, maybe we could get our elected officials to move. Our Fire Safe Council has been advocating for our county to change regulations for over a decade now, and nothing has changed.
So, Mike.
Yeah, that's a really good comment because I used to, when I said I worked for CAL FIRE, one of the programs that CAL FIRE has with Cal OES is the California Wildfire Mitigation Program, the retrofit program, and I started out when that was brand new, the concept of helping to develop that out. We ran into those same things, not in California, but with trying to leverage federal dollars, FEMA dollars, to further the California's investment to be able to retrofit more structures. But FEMA, unfortunately, the federal funding came with NEPA requirements, where in California, CEQA was exempt from defensible space. So, we ran into the same things there, and it caused basically a 2-year delay in the start of retrofitting homes. So yeah, it's a big concern and something that needs to be addressed. It's a little bit outside of our lane, but like I mentioned, we have worked a number of times with Headwaters Economics and similar partners, and that is definitely a space that they work more closely in than we do. So it'd be something to think about, that we could potentially work with them on a project like that.
Great. I would
Thank you.
encourage you to look at that CEQA exemption for what is it? I can't remember the heading that is under in CEQA, but if you read that carefully, it also requires you to hire experts. It has not been updated to acknowledge the 100 feet of defensible space that's now required. It's only for 30 feet. But you still have to hire experts to even use that exemption. So take a look at that, and please take back at your next board meeting or however your organization discusses things. Ask if others think that might be a worthy research project to look at, because to me, I believe that certainly in our county, we're primed for disaster. The Forest Service has rated our county at a higher risk to homes than 99% of counties in the United States. And we're still facing all these regulatory burdens if you wanted to try to do something to make your home safer.
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
I think one more question for the sake of time. Tina Bain in the chat put, I never hear much discussion about the risk of having a wooden deck. Have any studies been done on structures with decks?
Yes, we did a research on decks, and there's two different vulnerabilities to a deck. A fire happening underneath it, which of the two is the biggest threat, as a fire happening underneath versus embers landing on top and igniting a fire on top of the deck. But what happens when the fire happens underneath the deck is you also have all of the wood posts, the wood joists, the other structural members of the deck that are combustible and contribute to the spread of the fire. And the fire wants to go up, but it can't because of the deck, the walking surface boards. So it travels laterally underneath the surface and really becomes a large fire in a very short period of time. And as firefighters, during these fires, as they're triaging structures and deciding whether they can defend one or not defend it, if that deck is on fire, it's pretty certain that they're going to pass it by and try and defend a structure that they have a higher likelihood of being successful at defending. So and so what we really recommend, if you're building new, use non-combustible like posts and joists, and even the walking surface, if at all possible, make non-combustible. But if you go to our website, IBHS.org, look underneath our wildfire research, you'll find the paper on wood decks. And I'll try and find it and post it in the chat here during the next presentation.
Thanks, Steve. And it's about 3, so thank you so much for your presentation and
thanks for
your
having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And now I will hand it over to Jeremy Connally, Agency Manager for Farmers Insurance, the Connally Agency, to talk about they published a one-pager on the wildfire hardening discounts available for California Fair Plan, talk about immediate surrounding discounts, structure discounts, and the property level completion discount. So Jeremy, do you have a presentation I could share? I can make you co-host to do that.
I can share the actual flyer from the California Fair Plan. We can do that.
I just made you co-host. I could also share it on my end.
Perfect.
I don't think I have it here though.
Let's see here. And I'm just going to share that. All right. Theoretically, we can all see the fire hardening discounts.
Yes, I see it on my end.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Jeremy Connally with Connally Insurance. We have an office in Monterey. We write insurance primarily in Monterey County, but also all over the state. And obviously, because we're here, we do a lot with the high wildfire areas. And in the past, to get the wildfire discounts, you had to complete all 5 of the items in a category. to get the discount. If you had 4 of the 5, you didn't get the discount. And so now the Fair Plan has changed that, and the discounts are effectively a la carte, right? If you do 1, you get a percentage of the discount. If you do 2, you get more, etc. So we'll go through those. At the end of the day, the total discount is up to 26% when you add in the Firewise community, right? Because you can get up to 10% for being in a Firewise community. And so it can make a pretty significant impact to the premiums that you're paying, especially as we see Fair Plan premiums are relatively high. So we'll start here. Vegetation and debris has been cleared under decks. Essentially, they want nothing under your deck. I think Steve made it pretty clear that stuff under decks leads to fires, and fires under decks are not good things for your home. And the Fair Plan understands that. And so really what they're going to do or require is photos supporting all of the changes that have been made, right? So they're not just going to take your word for it. You got to prove it to the California Fair Plan. And before I get too deep into this, I want to let everybody know, don't jump off this call and go call your broker immediately after, because they're only applying these discounts within 30 days of renewal. So while it went into effect on 11/25, it's not eligible midterm, right? So don't like run out and try to get these things as these renewals come around. We're progressively seeing these, we're able to apply these discounts. So, if you were in October, it'll come to you and you'll be able to get to it. But for now, if you've been through a renewal, fine. But if you haven't renewed yet, it's not gonna, they're not gonna allow you to apply these. And one other good thing to note before I get too deep into this, effective April 1, so a dozen days from now, the California Fair Plan is going to have auto pay as an option for those of you that are on monthly or multiple time billings throughout the cycle. It doesn't work for one pay. So if you pay one time a year for your homeowner's insurance, that auto pay does not work. They won't allow it. And at every renewal, you're going to have to reset that auto pay. So even if you have it set up today for your 11 pay homeowners policy, when the policy renews, you're going to have to reset up auto pay. So it's not really a fire and forget. It is something that you'll have to do every year as the policy renews. All right, so let's jump into the discounts here. Again, we talked about vegetation and debris under decks. They want it perfectly cleared down to the ground. Vegetation, debris, mulch, and other combustible materials within 5 feet. So this is effectively your zone 0. 0 to 5 feet, no flammable materials. That includes landscaping, bark, and mulch immediately up against the home. It includes any vegetation immediately up against the home. It includes trees within 5 feet of the home. So for some of us that live in Carmel, you're working with the city and trying to get trees trimmed back. In some cases, we're not going to have so much luck with that one. But if you can get no flammable material within 5 feet, then you'll be able to apply that discount. The property has only non-combustible materials and any improvements, including fences and gates within 5 feet of the dwelling. So when I drive through my neighborhood, I would say 100% of the fences are wood, right? They come right up to the edge of the house and have gates. That would not qualify. So you either have to have a metal gate between where the wood is and the home for 5 feet. You can't have wood posts. You can't have wooden gates, plastic gates, etc. It truly has to be a non-combustible material for those fences. And again, they're pushing for compliance with zone 0, nothing flammable within 5 feet of the home. Combustible sheds or other outbuildings more than 30 feet from the dwelling. I think we saw a pretty effective video of why that's important today. And so that can become a challenge, right? If you've got a shed that holds your gardening equipment or your lawnmower or any of those things, and you have a relatively small yard, it can sometimes be challenging to get it greater than 30 feet from your home. But assuming that you don't have outbuildings within 30 feet of your dwelling, you can get that. Again, they're going to look at your property, right? So again, many of these homes I don't have 30 feet between my home and my neighbor. My neighbor has a shed that's within 30 feet of my home. They're really looking at your property and what's under your control. So there is some consideration for the fact that we can't make our neighbors take their sheds out. So they're really looking for what's on your property and what's under your control. And then again, trees surrounding the dwelling have been trimmed, brush, and debris removed from the yard, and the property is in compliance with state and local regulations. Basically, they want the same things that we're looking for in, for kind of standard insurance. So that is trees 5 feet from the home, 10 feet from the chimneys. We want to make sure that you've got, 3 times the ladder fuels trimmed down. So if you've got a 2-foot bush, that you've got 6 feet up to the flammable materials in your trees, right? So you're reducing your fuel load in your yard, and that you're in compliance with any of the defensible space components on the property. And then if they reject it, you can have an inspection, and that would suffice as long as it's in compliance with local regulations. So you can get 1, 2, 3, or all 5 in that category, and that's going to be your immediate surrounding discounts. As we start looking at the structure discounts, it's pretty straightforward. Class A roof, no, it does not include wood shake roofs, even though people tell me all the time they're Class A. So if it's a wood roof, we're not going to get the discount on that one. So this one's pretty straightforward. Most of the roofs, especially in new construction, are going to have a Class A roof. So we would get that. Enclosed eaves, I think Steve answered the question on that. This is going to be a boxed out eave. It's not going to include wire mesh. It's not going to include anything that's not a firm and very clear boxing out of the eaves. Ember resistant, the fire resistant vents. So sub, 1/8 inch mesh across the vents. And we're going to have photos of the vents to prove that you've done it both under the eaves, in the crawl spaces, and if you've got vents on the roof that have exposure, those are going to need to be covered as well. Multi-pane windows is typically, I don't know that we see shutters, like fireproof shutters really, or we haven't seen any in our agency. I imagine that there are some, and I've actually seen some of the different Firewise events that people sell, but typically it's going to be your double pane or triple pane windows that will comply with this. And then 6 inches from the bottom of the exterior wall of non-combustible material. So if you drive through Carmel, you'll see a lot of homes that have wood shingles for siding or some sort of wood siding. What they're going to want is the first 6 inches from the ground up, either some form of metal, cement, stucco, something that's non-combustible, so that as those embers fall and land and kind of rest there, that they're not resting against a combustible material that would ultimately ignite the rest of the home. So you can get any or all of those discounts in the event that you are able to get all 10 discounts, right? The immediate surrounding discounts, the structure discounts. There's an additional discount for the property level completion. So you've done it all. You've hardened your home as much as possible. You can get that discount. When you put all of those discounts together, that can add up to 16.4%. So it's a pretty significant discount that would apply. And then the Firewise discount, again, is up to 10%. So if you're doing everything, you can have a pretty significant discount. That's on personal lines. On commercial, they're doing the same thing. It's a slightly lower number, so it's 13.8. So that's going to be HOAs, commercial buildings, things like that. But the whole community for an HOA, as an example, would have to comply with this for the commercial discounts to apply. So what you'll find about the FAIR plan is that they will do what they say, but they're going to be sticklers about the details, right? So it's not good enough to be close enough. It has to actually meet their standards, or they'll simply reject the discount. So make sure that as you're, doing these things or making the changes, that you're not spending money unnecessarily. And, And you can reach out to the Fair Plan and ask for clarity on these items. That's ultimately what we do when we're not sure or a client calls us. They're the ultimate arbiter. So as a broker for the California Fair Plan, I want to clarify like what my role is with them. I simply represent you to the California Fair Plan. I'm not an agent of the Fair Plan. I think that's an important distinction. I can't bind a policy. I can't quote a policy. I can submit information, and then the Fair Plan provides a quote back to me. I can't make changes to your policy. I submit information on your behalf to the Fair Plan, and the Fair Plan makes changes to your policy. So as an agent, like with farmers who we represent, I can go in and make changes to your policy today. I can quote for you today. Those are things that I can do on a regular basis. I'm an agent. That means that I represent the company and then I represent them to the public. As a broker, which is what we are with the Fair Plan, and as are all others, we represent you to the company. So we can't make changes. We can't deal with claims. We can't give you quotes. What we do is submit your information, and then the Fair Plan comes back to us with the approval of an endorsement, which is changes to your policy, with the approval of a quote and the final quote numbers. So as you're dealing with your agent, please have a little patience with them because we're dealing with the same things that you are when you're interacting with the Fair Plan, in that we're subject to their timelines. We're subject to their response rates. And we do our very best to get your information to them quickly. That doesn't necessarily mean that that information comes back to us as quickly. That's the Fair Plan. As we're starting to look at homes and things in general, some of the things we're starting to see and that you may start to experience is companies are starting to look at the age of properties, particularly around plumbing and electrical panels. So today, if you get an inspection and you're selling a home, one of the things that I can virtually guarantee the inspector is going to look at and call out are the type of electrical panels that we have. So things like Federal Pacific, Stablock, Zinsco are all known fire hazards. And insurance carriers are now starting to say, yeah, if it has one of those for new business, we're not going to insure. So just be aware that as you're looking at things that can reduce your fire exposure, we often, because we see it most and the big ones come from wildfire, but we deal with in the insurance business domestic fires every single day, right? We deal with fires that start in the electrical panels. We deal with fires that start in the kitchen. So as you're thinking about fire and fire hazards, look at your electrical panels. Make sure you have a fire extinguisher under your sink or somewhere near your cooking surfaces. Make sure that it's the right one to be able to put out those domestic fires, because some of the things that cause houses to burn down have absolutely nothing to do with the vegetation surrounding them or wildfires going through. So that's what I have for today. Very often people have questions for me, and I see a couple of chats, but I'll do what I can to answer those. Jennifer, I'll kind of kick it back to you.
All right, thanks. Thank you for the rundown on California Fair Plan and those discounts. And let's see, maybe the first question here. Well, I think it might have already been answered through your presentation, but these discounts are only for if you're on the Fair Plan, and that's your last, resort for getting insured, right?
Yeah, these are solely for the California Fair Plan. So typically when you have the Fair Plan, you have the Fair Plan and then what's called a difference in conditions policy. Sometimes we call them a wrap or a companion policy. These discounts will not apply to those, right? Those policies pick up water losses, burglary damage, weight of ice and snow, liability losses, et cetera. So these are only for the California Fair Plan. Some companies, actually, I think all companies are mandated by state to recognize some sort of fire hardening. So as you are doing this, do work with your agent if you're not on the Fair Plan. Every company is a little different, right? So I couldn't give you like if you do this, you get that. But many companies are recognizing Firewise. Many companies are recognizing the fire hardening components. So if you're doing some of those fire hardenings, work with your agent or broker, and you may be able to apply discounts for the fire hardening work that you're doing. They just won't align perfectly with what you're seeing here from the FAIR plan.
Okay, thank you. And a question in the chat, Dan says, if our home is IBHS wildfire prepared certified, and they're also in a Firewise community, does that meet the 12 discount criteria?
So if they're the FAIR plan doesn't really recognize anybody else. And so what I mean by that is if you meet the IBHS certification, then that probably means that you meet all of the criteria for them, but they're going to require that you document, not say, here's my certificate. They're going to require that you document each of the items that is listed here with photos supporting that it is compliant. And so the answer is, yeah, you're probably going to qualify for all the discounts, right? The home hardening, the surrounding space, and the Firewise, but you're just going to have to show that information. The good thing is the FAIR plan does get updates every 2 weeks on the Firewise communities, so they're starting to automatically apply those discounts. If you weren't a Firewise and have become a Firewise community, or you're purchasing a home in a Firewise community, they often already have that information. So that is good news that they weren't doing prior.
Yeah, great news. I mean, I hadn't heard of that before, like the 2 weeks getting that information. And you mentioned a lot of the documenting. So what would be sort of a best practice if someone were to go to, you as a broker for trying to get these discounts if they had previous knowledge? You said photos, anything else that might help?
Photos. Yep, we're gonna have to submit photos to we're gonna submit photos through an endorsement to the California FAIR plan, and they're gonna look at those photos. And so I want to be careful to say more is better, right? Like we don't want just kind of lots and lots of photos. If you can take a photo that shows a number of things, fantastic. But they are going to make sure that the eaves are boxed out, the vents have the mesh, that you do have nothing under the decks, those kind of things.
All right, thank you. Richard, you have your hand up for a question?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. Jeremy, thank you for your presentation. You just touched on my question with regards to structures. What in your experience has been acceptable for the FAIR plan as far as enclosed eaves? Do they need to be boxed in with lumber? Can they be closed with, appropriate mesh? What are they finding is an acceptable
no,
eaves
it needs to be a hard material such as wood or metal that's boxing in those eaves. They don't accept mesh.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and then because when you're boxing in your eaves, typically you're kind of covering over the vents that go into the attic. There will be vents in the boxed out eaves, and those have to also have the 1/8-inch mesh, right? So just because it's not going directly into your attic, anything that's venting around the property is going to have that 1/8-inch meshing. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Anything else?
Not that I see in the chat, but
Okay.
I already asked my one question for the best practice if anyone was going to, so let me see if I had any others. So this is from November 2025. Is this in relation to the caps being removed on writing new homeowners insurance with the policies with California FAIR plan? It might be unrelated, but I think in November they had published this and also were motivated to write new policies. This might be
let me clarify that because I think it gets a little confusing. So the California FAIR plan doesn't have any caps, right? They have to accept whatever risks come their way as long as they're compliant with their underwriting guidelines. They don't have an option to say no. What's happened though is a number of things. For a limited period of time, they did expand their commercial appetite from 20 million to 100 million. Right. So they did open that in an effort to provide particularly homeowners associations, which were wildly underinsured, and some of the large commercial buildings coverage that they just couldn't find in the marketplace, with the hope that carriers would come back to the marketplace over that period of time. And then that's going to go away. They're not looking to expand the fair plan is not looking to expand the number of homes that are coming in, and their regulations or rules are rather draconian. Miss a payment by a day, policy cancels, you have to rewrite the whole thing. They're looking to get risk off the book. What's happening though is the Department of Insurance is leaning on insurance carriers to expand where they're writing, right? So carriers, as they're getting rate increases, are having to expand their appetite into high wildfire areas, meaning that they're having to write 85% of their overall market shares in areas that have historically been considered high wildfire. As an example, with the State Farm renewal, where they allowed them to take the rate increase on their homeowners policies, they also prohibited them from issuing more non-renewals, right? So what's happening is the Department of Insurance, in concert with insurance carriers and the FAIR Plan, are all finding ways to push more of the homeowners policies back into the standard market, pull the risk away from the California FAIR Plan, so that we don't have the issues that we had in the Southern California fires, where the FAIR Plan and its reinsurance blew through their reserves, blew through the reinsurance. And then what happens in that scenario is not that the FAIR Plan goes bankrupt like a normal carrier would. What they do is they push all those excess losses out to the admitted carriers in the state of California. That's your State Farms, Allstates, Farmers, AAAs, USAAs, et cetera. And they assess them for the losses that aren't covered by reserves and reinsurance. And so what you may see, or may have already seen, is a lot of those carriers are pushing those through to the consumer level, right? So you may see a 2 or 3% assessment fee on your bill for your homeowners policies. They're also seeing it on the commercial side of the world, so that the companies can recoup those losses to pay for the FAIR Plan's losses. So ultimately, FAIR Plan never runs out of money because they have the right to assess the insurance companies. The insurance companies have the right to assess their consumers. So at the end of the day, it's you all and me with the homeowners policy that are going to pay for any losses to the FAIR Plan. So it ultimately rolls back to the consumers of the state of California when there's losses in excess of what the FAIR Plan's collected in premiums.
Okay, thanks for your answer. One more question came in.
Yep.
If you meet the IBHS certification requirements and qualify for the FAIR Plan, what is the likelihood of getting standard insurance? So I assume getting off the FAIR Plan.
Yeah, so unfortunately, in my experience, there are very few carriers that are underwriting on an individual level. There are a few, but there aren't very many that look at a home kind of individually. They look at areas, right? So they look at the 3 components that make up fire scoring: fuel, slope, and access, right? And so if you're in an area that's got a heavy fuel load, and when I mean fuel, I'm talking brush, trees, grass, those kind of things, open space that's got flammable materials in it. So you've got heavy fuels, you've got steep slopes, right? Because any firefighter will tell you that the steeper the slope, the more intense the fire burns, the quicker it spreads, the more difficult it is to defend on, right? We can't get the dozers across really steep hillsides to cut, not safely at least, to cut those fire breaks. And then access, right? So how quickly can the fire departments get to your property? Is there an entrance and an egress, right? Because they're obviously concerned about protecting your home, but they're, and justifiably so, more concerned about protecting manpower and equipment, right? Because that manpower and equipment can go to the next fire and the next fire and the next fire. The one home burning down isn't worth risking the human life and the material capital that is going to be used to fight continued fires. So if they don't have access or they don't have an egress, they're going to be less likely to roll up, all their assets deep into a place where they can't get out if the fire burns behind the lines. So those are the 3 things we look at. So even if someone has done an amazing job, but they're in a high fuel area and a lot of slope and limited access, carriers are still very reluctant to insure that home, even if they've done all the IBHS requirements, got the certifications, In some cases, with the carriers that we work with, you can keep your insurance, right? So if they had your insurance and you've done that and they were working to non-renew, they may keep the policy, but they're not necessarily looking to expand. Now, as time goes on, that certification may be something that the Department of Insurance or someone else comes along and says, look, if the consumers are doing all these things, they have the zero, zone zero completely free of flammable material. They've got a non-combustible siding. They've boxed out their eaves. They have Class A roofs. You guys have to relook at these risks in a different way. That's not today, but there's nothing to say that that's not something that's coming down the road. So unfortunately, today that certification isn't necessarily going to open the door to finding a standard carrier, but it certainly can get you discounts with the FAIR plan or the company you have, or it can keep your insurance in place if the companies are looking for ways to get off of risk, but you've met the qualification to prevent the fire. I'm not sure that's a great answer, but that's the answer that we have today.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see any more questions, but for just to take a step back and see if someone were to renew and they have those 30 days, what would be, the timeline for then approaching getting these discounts within those 30 days?
Oh, yeah. So again, I would say just reach out to whoever the broker is.
Okay.
And so have your photos ready. And when you're 30 days before your renewal, reach out to the broker and say, hey, I believe that I qualify for items 1, 2, and 3 on the immediate surroundings and all 5 items on the structure discount. I've got my photos. Can I send those to you, and will you submit them, with the request to the California FAIR plan? That's typically how you would get that submitted, go through the endorsement process, and then that would impact the rate and the renewal.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
And I think I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks
And
for having me.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And I think we're ready to maybe wrap up. I only have a couple closeout items for today. So I will share my screen to see if we can do that. All right, so as Fire Safe Council is trying to look ahead for the next year, I would like to invite you to submit a survey response for our 2026 Firewise Community Needs Survey. So it helps us prioritize events and programs, projects for your communities, and it helps tailor our support. Also, I would like, sorry, my Siri went off. So here's the survey. This is what it looks like. I will put it in the chat really quickly if I can get this. All right. And I would greatly appreciate it. From this, we make a report, and then we kind of plan out the rest of the year from that. So thank you all. If you can submit that if you're part of Firewise community or you've been interested in Firewise in the past. And here are some of the resources. Again, we published these slides and also the video recording for you to take home. There have also been some great links and resources put in the chat by Steve. And I think it is the IBHS on mitigations that matter, vegetation and zone zero, and as well as the 1-pager for the California wildfire hardening discounts. Some upcoming events. So on March 29th, it's a Sunday. It's the California Wildlife Day. So we will be tabling there between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. We also have our board meeting on the last Thursday of the month. This time it falls on March 26th between 10:30 a.m. and noon. Also, I will be hosting Firewise 101 on April 8th between 2 and 3 via Zoom. And on April 25th, we have Carmel Prepares at the Sunset Center, ran by CERT or Carmel CERT, between 10 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. So with that, I think I can stop the recording and stop my share. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers for joining today and speaking and lending their expertise for us today. I greatly appreciate it. So yeah, thank you all for joining. Now I'll stop the recording now.